Brandon?
Here.
Adil?
Yeah.
Marina?
Here.
Mainly is here. Weechow is here. Yalen is here. And Yihai Zhang. Okay. Okay. Two things. Okay. Okay, Yihai Zhang, I see that your grade on the midterm does not show up, so I'll have to go.
Yeah, so then we,
Nothing, it just says,
okay.
it doesn't mean anything. Your
Okay.
grade's got 100 or 0, it's nothing to do with the grade.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm just sorry that your grade is the only grade that doesn't show.
Okay. Yes.
Okay, but I will fix that. Okay, so that's the one thing I wanted to make, so if you can't find your grade, it's my grade, not your fault.
Yeah.
Okay? The other comment I wanted to make, firstly, there was some PowerPoints missing, and that's what I was trying to work on before when I got here, that I think that chapter 15, I don't think the PowerPoints were posted on Blackboard. No one sent me an email, right, to complain about it. So that was interesting. But anyways, I tried to put them there now, but I had two PowerPoints that were significantly different in length. So I hope, but I did post the chapter 15 PowerPoint. In any case, I did do that, but I have to go check because I seem to have had two, and that's what I was trying to go through before. Okay, but I was sorry about that chapter, we didn't have a PowerPoint. And the other thing I wanted to tell you, I said to listen to me, I'll talk to you about grades. It's most of the grades in the 70s should have been significantly lower. And instead of saying this is the grade, we're going to curve it, so I just had different ways of marking it and how to give people at least X amount of points on a question, even though maybe none of it was right. But I would like you to understand that, most of the grades in the 70s, and if I'm just looking at them, I could say, yeah, except for one, but all the other grades in the 70s, really you should have failed. And if you want to talk to me about your midterm, I'll be glad to do it. But you should probably know that yourself after you finish the exam. And yeah, most of you knew something, knew what we were talking about, so you could, write an answer that made sense, but it didn't necessarily answer the question. And so I wanted to mention that to you. And Marina, you didn't get to do the homework for tonight, did you?
I was going to submit.
Okay, you did. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't me. Fine.
Yeah,
Okay.
I just was.
Okay. So that's what I wanted to say. And on the other hand, I would say, the grades in the 80s, were pretty real, and were at least in the 80s, and if you got something like an 88 or 87, that was a good grade, really a good grade. But what I wanted to let you know was if you got a grade in the 70s, yes, I'm not going to count it as less than the 70 if you want to know, in figuring out final grades and the like, I'm going to use the grades that you got on Blackboard, so you don't have to worry about that. But I think you should also know that, your answers, or a lot of your answers just, disappointed. Okay. okay? And if you wanna talk about them more, it's not gonna change anything now, so we can talk about it, tell me you're gonna wanna talk about it. Oh, the Monday after, the first day after spring break is a Monday, 2 weeks from tonight, and we can meet, before class, that's when I have office hours anyways, but let me know you're gonna come and you wanna go over it. I'll be happy to do it with you, okay? If you don't want to, also, but I just thought it was fair to tell you that if you got those grades, they were, you might just look at it. The exam itself had a 10-point curve because it was at 110. So in addition to that, you can say that your grade in the 70s had, another, at least another 15 points. So, so I just wanted you to know that. And if you want to go over your paper, I'll really be happy to do that. Okay? And, maybe get some understanding of what you meant on some of those things. I'll be happy to do that. Just let me know that you're going to want to do that, so I'll make sure to be here, that we can talk about it, And if you can't get here, early on a Monday, then let me know. Just send me an email, and I'll get back to you for the phone number, and we'll make up another time that we can use. Okay? I'll be happy to do that. If you want to go over your exam, I have the exam here we can talk about. Okay? Yeah. And, excuse me. Okay, so I was, I guess in the 70s I was disappointed, but c'est la vie. Okay, so now if we're going to talk about chapter 15, quality concepts. Quality concepts is a important chapter. It's not a difficult chapter, and it's more talking about what do we mean by quality, what do we mean by good enough, and some of the other issues around quality and quality assessment. And I think after chapter 15, I said we would skip 16, and we would go to 17, which was software quality assurance. And those were the two I've given you homework on for tonight, because I wanted to make sure that you at least had, read those two chapters. And we're only going to go through 15 tonight, but it helps if you have some understanding of 17 as well, because 15 and 17 are really a package, and that you have to understand quality concepts, and then the next field is social quality assurance. What are the different ways we can go about that? I don't know if some of you here might be working in healthcare. There's a whole, in healthcare and hospitals, there's a whole quality assurance department in hospitals, and all they do is basically, they review all the results from doctors, and doctors who all do the same surgery, and the results of the surgery, and looking at the results, looking at other results of doctors from patients. And one way of doing quality assurance in hospitals, at least, is, looking at all of those results, to get an understanding of quality overall for the hospital, but also oftentimes then, talking with physicians, where it appears to be that, the quality, of what they've been doing could be questionable. And so, it's, quality assurance, what we're talking about here in the text is quality assurance in terms of a systems development area, but what am I doing? I want to here is what I just added, so this is the 15 that I added, it's one of the two that I found. And so, if you look at the blackboard now, you'll see it has been added, and so this is, okay. Okay, so if we're talking about here what is quality, and we're talking about here inequality in terms of systems development activities, but I just, gave you an example in the real world of quality and healthcare. Also realize that when we're talking about what do we mean about quality, over here we break it into 3 different kinds of quality. Have any one of you taken course in operations management, say undergraduate? Okay. If you're taking a course in operations management, you would also see how there are, different dimensions of quality. And quality is not just, one dimension. The other point, but if you haven't taken that, so that's not a good example for you. But another thing is, if I ask you to tell me what's high quality, most people would have a difficult time explaining it. It's sort of like, I can tell when it's high quality. And, to one person, quality might mean, high quality, say, you buy a sweater, might be, the material, might be, how exacting it's stitched or whatever. So different things might, to you, indicate that, yeah, I bought a sweater that's high quality, right? But overall, it's like, I can tell if it's high quality. And that's probably true with systems development as well. And so quality is a difficult word to actually, the people should define what they actually mean. Okay, so one of the ways we go about understanding it, specifically in systems development, is we talk about, it's a characteristic or attribute of something which is nice, but defining what that characteristic or attribute is difficult for people to do. And so we talk about quality of design, conformance, and satisfaction. Okay, design, this says that, how well the systems, product was actually designed, how well the job we did on requirements, on specifications, logical design, physical design. And so what's the quality of the design? So just reading all of that, does this appear to be high quality? Quality of conformance is when you say, okay, now I'm going to look at the finished product. How well does the finished product conform it's an issue focused primarily on implementation, because conformance says, okay, you may have done a great job on, requirements, specifications, and design, but then you did a horrible job on implementation, and it didn't really conform to the great job that you did on the design portion. So that's, quality of design, quality of conformance, and then lastly, user satisfaction is, compliant product, good quality, and delivery within budget and schedule. They usually, add up to a high user satisfaction. Okay, and again, there too, I know that you could probably find some user groups that would have some other definition or way of defining user satisfaction, but this is a reasonably good one. So basically, that's just to understand. When we try to understand quality, there are, within systems development, there are three ways or three points in this development and implementation process where we could evaluate quality. Look at it, you can evaluate quality after the design, you can evaluate quality after the implementation, and then you can evaluate quality based on user satisfaction. Okay, it's a philosophical view, which relates more to what I was talking about. You know what it is, but yet you don't know what it is. And this is what I was talking about. That we really don't understand what is quality, and it's hard to define. And quality does exist, right? Because why else would people pay fortunes for some things and throw others in the trash pile? And so what the hell is quality? What is it? And if you read this, or this is from the book, I think I tend to spend more time on this than you would have to, because I could have just gone straight into, here are the three dimensions of quality we're going to talk about for systems development. But what I'm trying to explain is coming up with those three is not that easy. And when people have to evaluate quality, understand that it can often be subjective. Okay? And I say it's subjective, the text calls it pragmatic views. And so, I came up, the book came up, and it's relatively well accepted. You have how well was the system designed, then was the actual implementation in accordance with the design, and finally user satisfaction. Okay, those are three relatively straightforward. But if you want a more transcendental view that says what I was talking about, you can view it right away, but you can't really define it. The user view is end users. Manufacturer's view is sometimes what people call the making sure a product matches its original specification. Manufacturer's view, the product view, I misspoke. Manufacturer's view would be the conformance. Quality of conformance, how well the actual product matches what was designed. The product view is quality can be tied to inherent characteristics, functions, and features of a product. And lastly, and this is probably from a practical point of view, the value-based view, that isn't quality basically depending how much the customer is willing to pay for the product? Now you can say, I know that, I do a much worse job of marketing than you do, so we can both be selling the same product, and you can sell it for $4,000, I'm going to sell it for $500, but it's the same product. It doesn't mean that your, quality is, in a value-based view is twice as much. But, leaving out, that marketing, characteristic will, that quality is how much a customer's willing to pay for a product. In other words, if I'm selling both, and I have two versions, and I can sell one for twice the other one, and in essence, they're both supposed to be doing the same job. They both meet the same requirements, and I can sell one for twice of the other. So that value-based view said, quality in theory should be better on the one I can sell for twice as much, and that's assuming they meet the same requirements, and each of the quantitatively measurable characteristics are basically the same. So the only thing you could attribute to would be product. So you could see quality encompasses all of these views, and you could add more, but the three we'll use primarily are the three that we listed before. The design, the implementation, and then the user satisfaction. But I thought it was worthwhile what this text went through, because if you even, so here's in English, an effective software process applied in a manner that creates a useful product, providing measurable value for those who produce it and those who use it. So that's interesting. Measurable value for those who produce it, because, you're getting paid for it, and those who use it because it's giving you the benefits and the reason why you bought it. So it's interesting. Over here, there's a little bit of a twist for those who produce it and those who use it. Yeah, there's a value to those who produce it, because I'm not doing this for my health. I'm doing this, this is for my income, right? So that's the value to me is the fact that I'm able to sell it and make money, and the value to you is that it basically, gives you the benefits of why you purchased it. What's important is, and here you can look the advantages of providing useful products. You can look at these three, read them as I'm talking. What's important to understand, and I keep trying to show you these differences. If you were taking a basic course talking about, MIS and project development and implementation, and if they even covered quality, they would just cover it with the three definitions you had right at the beginning of the class. Quality in terms of the design, quality of the implementation, and then quality in terms of user satisfaction. And one of the differences is in terms of how we're looking at the overall development process in this class is trying to give it a more nuanced approach that, this saying quality, here are these three things, and that's it. That sort of ignores the fact that in the real world, most everyone thinks they can judge good quality of something. Okay, and no two people probably are judging it the same way. And so I think it's important to realize that, because even though we're saying that the systems development process, we're saying is an engineering process, right? It's software engineering. And we have actually gotten approved to say the development process is an engineering product, and therefore it should be, quantifiable, repeatable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but what about quality? Quality is something that, if we talk about it, is, not something that you would think, does that fall under, something that's, part of engineering. And so what we can do is we can parse out some definitions that help understand what quality is, that we can actually quantitatively measure, and that we can then say it does mean it, it doesn't mean. But realize when you're looking at quality as a whole, it's probably not something that you could include within when you break quality down and say, okay, what we're going to do when we talk about quality, we're going to mean these three things, and these things are measurable, and these three things are quantifiable, then it's fine. Okay? So, understand that difference. Okay? You know, and it sounds like, you know, how many angels dance on the head of a pin, but it's important to realize the differences, because when you go through the system development process, you know, most of what we do is we're going to try to prove is quantitative, and that's why, you know, one phase is going to be better than another phase. You're comparing one product against another product, and to make all those comparisons, you know, to make them valid comparisons, they're really got to be quantifiable. And when you think about it, within the development process that we talked about up until tonight, again, you know, we really have to strain on occasion to define each of these process steps in a quantifiable manner. And so that, you know, to realize it doesn't come natural. Okay, it wasn't a natural, well, obviously systems development is an engineering discipline. It wasn't one of these, knee-jerk reactions, of course it is. Okay, so over here we're talking about a useful product creates software product revenue, that's for the developer, better profitability when its application supports a business process, because you'll be able to increase your revenue, and improved availability of information that is crucial for the business. Okay? And so, improved availability is making us crucial for the business if it does a better job in supporting the business process. And what that will do is create greater product revenue. And then you could say that the product revenue that created is basically a surrogate for, what's the quality? Because if it's worth more, i.e. people will pay more to the people who are buying this because they have a need for these features to give them these benefits. So, by definition, you could say they're paying more because the quality is greater, almost by default. And so we can also look at quality, and this is something that gets back when we're going to go to software quality assurance, which is that next chapter I'm going to cover, is the effective process. An effective software process establishes the infrastructure that supports building a high-quality product. The management aspects of project include checks and balances to avoid project chaos, and software engineering practices allow the developer to analyze the problem and design a solid solution, both critical to building high-quality software. So what basically we're saying is that the software engineering practices that we've talked about today help us analyze the problem and design a solid solution. Okay? And both critical to building high-quality software, but of those 3 points we had at the beginning, they both only address the first point. They don't address the implementation, and it doesn't address the user satisfaction. Okay? And umbrella activities such as change management and technical reviews have as much to do with quality as any other part of software engineering practice, and that's important to understand that within any development environment, there are the specific tasks that you're working on that have to be completed for this particular product. And then there are, the overall environment, the overall supporting tasks that don't just apply to this part of your building, but apply to any product that your organization is building, and that's change management, technical reviews, and they also help make sure that you're developing a high-quality design of the solution. And what that really is saying is that it's probably fair to say, and I'll go out on a limb and say that if you have very poor change management processes in your organization, and so that says it's going to be much more difficult to do a great job in analyzing a problem, designing a solution, and then potentially implementing a solution. If you don't have, a good set of change management processes in place, I don't say it's impossible, but it makes it a heck of a lot more difficult to get any of these analysis, design, or implementation tasks done. And done properly, and done effectively, and done with a high level of quality. And so, what this really says is that we tend to get the umbrella activities. What we tend to measure is how good a job that we do in analyzing the problem and designing the solution. Okay, and we leave by the wayside what are all the supporting activities that we needed to allow us to actually, analyze, design, and then implement a solution to the problem or a way of leveraging an opportunity. Okay? And then when we talk about what we've actually delivered, what's a useful product? Okay, it delivers the content, functions, and features, i.e. the benefits that the end user desires, but it also delivers these characteristics in a reliable, error-free way. A useful product satisfies those requirements that have been explicitly stated by stakeholders, and it also satisfies a set of implicit requirements that are expected of all high-quality software. So what it really says is that a useful product, okay, is one that basically delivers all the features that give the users the benefits that they're looking for. But that's, that's the requirements and the needs that have been explicitly stated by stakeholders. And so, but then there's also the implicit requirements that are expected of all high-quality software, and those implicit requirements are like, what we had on the preceding slide, things like the overall development environment, okay, which have a significant impact on the overall quality, but they're implicit requirements. They're not explicit requirements as stated by the users or the stakeholders. Okay? Because what we are actually going to measure are the explicit requirements. And we're going to take the implicit requirements, so to speak, as a given if we're able to actually meet those explicit requirements. By adding value for the producer and the user, high-quality software provides benefits both for the producer and the user. The development organization gains value because it requires less maintenance effort fewer bug fixes, and reduced customer support. And that's obviously a benefit to the users, but it's also a benefit, think about it, to the development group, right? Because you gotta spend less resources. Because high quality software, you're gonna spend less money on maintenance, less money in fixing bugs, less money on customer support. So, yes, you could say these are benefits to the end user, but they're also primarily they're benefits to the software organization because they're reducing your costs and the user community because it provides a useful capability in a way that expedites some business process. And so this is another way of looking at the quality factors, and where you can look about, there's, product transition, operation, and revision. And what's interesting, if you look at what are the key components of quality for each of these parts, let's call it, of the development process, okay? So in the, product transition, it's portability, reusability, interoperability, product revisions, testing, flexibility, and then again, testing again, as you're making changes, and then once it's in operation, correctness, reliability, usability, integrity, and efficiency. And so what these is another way of looking at quality and saying is, what characteristics are we looking at and what characteristics should we be looking at depending on where we are in building this process overall. Okay, so that's called quality factors, and it's a way of also showing how there is quality that comes into play wherever you are in terms of the development process. So this is a useful way of looking at quality and how it impacts each part of the development process. Okay, quality and use. This is an ISO, an international definition of effectiveness, efficiency, satisfaction, freedom from risk, and context coverage. And this was, ISO standards or sets of international standards that have been agreed upon. So for quality and use, these are the characteristics that ISO says should be included in quality for quality and use. And that you might say, if you look at that Lopez triangle, we looked at a couple of slides earlier, so that's the one, that's the kind for the being operation, that bottom part of the triangle is what this, ISO definition of how they would define the elements of quality. Okay, then we go back into functional student. Here we're going back into a more detailed definition of what are all the types of product quality. And again, what's interesting, if you look at all these, all of these are characteristics that you could also define quantitatively. Okay, so So up until now, we've been talking about quality, what we mean by quality, and how we can look at it quantitatively. But when we look at a qualitative quality assessment, it's where you're looking at the whole software product as a whole, and you might decide to create a user questionnaire or a set of structured tasks for users to perform for each quality factor you want to assess. You could observe the users while they perform these tasks and have them complete the questionnaire when they finish. For some quality factors, it may be important to test the software actually in the production environment, and that this is not just going what we've been talking about till now. You might relate back to something we've called user acceptance testing, which is before the product has been placed into production, and that for some quality factors you actually need to test the software in the production environment, because it's not just looking at this product in the pristine world of the lab, so to speak, but looking at how this product performs in the real world, or once it is in production. And the quantitative is the software engineering community really pushes us for these quantitative assessments. So you can use software metrics for internal code attributes, and whenever the software metrics computed for a section of code fall outside of a range, it may signal the existence of a quality problem. Metrics represent indirect measurement, right? Because we can't really measure quality, true? All we can measure are these other manifestations that we say taken together comprise quality. So the metrics are really indirect measures. We're looking at what can we measure quantitatively and directly, and say that if we measure these groups of characteristics, together these groups of characteristics will give you a understanding or an overall value of quality. And again, it doesn't make a difference if you go back to right at the beginning where we had the three, then we looked at recalls, then we looked at the ISO definition. But what we're seeing is, whichever one of those we use, they're basically all measuring the same things, and the difference is how many surrogate characteristics are they measuring, and you could be measuring in the way we first started with looking at those three characteristics of quality, or you could go all the way to each of the characteristics included in the ISO guideline, and it's not that they're different. There's just how fine a definition do you want to use, and if you use all of the components within the ISO definition, what does that say? That says you have a more complete evaluation of all of these areas that comply with quality. In other words, you're not just looking at some large, higher level elements that are somewhat abstracted that you can measure to say that quality, but you're actually going down looking at a more detailed definition of characteristics and measuring those to enough. And software quality dilemma is and that's where we really get into talking about good enough software, because if you produce a product that has horrible quality, however you define it, no one will want to buy it, and at some point you'll go out of business. On the other hand, if you spend a huge amount of time and effort and money to build a close to perfect piece of software that's going to take so long to complete and be so expensive to produce, you'll also end up going out of business. So the question is, where's that magical middle ground where the product is good enough not to be rejected right away, but also not the object of somewhat perfectionism that it would take too long or cost too much to complete. And so what we're really saying is that, software that's good enough, depending how you're defining good enough, is not necessarily a negative. And when we started this discussion, if I had said, well, does it make sense to develop software that's just good enough? Most people would say no. But again, it depends how you define good enough. And we're all saying, how do we define what we mean by over here, what we're just calling that magical middle ground between having a product that's so bad that no one wants to buy it, or that costs so much money and takes so long to build that no one wants to buy it. And either way, you're not in business. And so that gets into a discussion of good enough software, and it is true that good enough may work in some domains for a few major software companies. If you work for a small company and you develop a good enough, i.e. buggy product, you risk permanent damage to your reputation. And if you work in certain application domains, developing good enough might even be considered negligent and open yourself up to litigation. So you see, it really, and that's one of the reasons why, you get asked the question, what are the pluses and minuses of developing good enough software? Is that a reasonable objective for you to have in your company, to develop good enough software? And the answer is, it depends on what you mean by good enough software, and also, what business you're in. Because clearly, if it's real-time embedded software and there's any level of errors, it could even open you up to litigation. If you're a small company and you can't afford black marks against your reputation, even though the product is usable, it could harm your company enough that you might go out of business. On the other hand, Microsoft has been very successful for decades on developing and releasing new releases of software when they will tell you, the beta release and then the initial general release, they're still going to have some bugs, and we'll fix them as you find them and tell us about them, and that's how we come out with new releases. It's not just to add new capabilities. And so largely, how come it works for Microsoft and it doesn't work for your company? Your company might even have developed a better product than in terms of being bug-free and tested than Microsoft, but Microsoft can make the millions of dollars and you go out of business for the same level of not good enough. so what that really says, we have now something else to look at. We're looking at not just the product, not just the suitability of the product for the needs evidenced by the users, but it's also a function of what is the reputation of your company, and to what extent can your company stay in business and become happy, a profitable company and grow if you're saying is, our initial release of products, you're probably going to find some bugs. So it's going to work, but you're probably going to find some bugs. That's not a way for a small company to actually build market share, right? And so that's another dimension that we didn't even really talk about. So it says the same level of software might make this company millions of dollars and might put this company out of business. It's interesting thought that I think the text doesn't even explain it that way, but that's what it really means. And so what we're saying here is, now wait a minute, we said that we were coming up with quantitative assessments, right? Because we want this to be a software engineering product. So now what we're saying is the same level of good enough can put one company out of business and can make millions of dollars for another company. How is that a quantitative assessment? I don't have a good answer to that question, but I think it's something that it's important we realize, even though it may not be phrased that way in the books, is that the environment that you're working in and the environment that your company has created, is creating that floor, and it says there's still the same evaluation of both, but you know what, if you're a little company with, not a very long track record, maybe people don't want to take a chance. Are these bugs going to be fixed? And fixed within a reasonable period of time? Well, if you're dealing with a Microsoft product, well, you're sort of confident that those bugs that you find initially are going to be fixed with new releases quickly. And based on their track record, you're not worried about it. So over here, it's really saying is your evaluation of the software quantitatively might be the same, but the difference is your evaluation, so to speak, of those underlying characteristics we spoke about earlier, is in this case, you're saying is you don't have a high enough certainty that these bugs, so to speak, will be corrected and corrected quickly. In these cases, given the track record of the company, you do have enough faith, if you will, that they will be corrected and corrected quickly enough. And that's just as what we spoke about earlier. Remember we talked about the underlying, characteristics? So this isn't an underlying characteristic of, the building of your product, but it just says this is an overall assessment of the company, and to what extent can or do I want to leverage, I need this software for my company to be a success, so to what extent do I want to leverage my success on the faith that, this company is going to quickly fix any of the bugs that come up. Okay, what that also says is what? That in a small company, you probably need to develop and prove that you have developed and sold a piece of software that is more good enough than if you were selling it from Microsoft. It's virtually impossible when we get through testing, we'll talk about it to fully 100% test that something's correct. But what we're saying is, if you're working for a small company, you've got to be able to show that you're much closer to fully correct than you do if you're working for a large company with that track record of quickly fixing bugs. Okay, so now what we're saying here again is, okay, still we come back to, yeah, it is still quantitative, and the only difference is that what we added is a quantitative element as to what is the reputation of your organization. Is your organization, does it have any reputation? Is it too new? Is it too small? In other words, is there a reputation that says, yeah, it works and there are going to be some bugs in the initial releases, and yes, they typically are corrected and released quickly, as opposed to if there's no way to say, can I have confidence that they will be corrected and released quickly? So again, what you see is, yeah, it can be quantitative, except we're not measuring the quantitative problems with the software, we're measuring the quantitative level of experience in that this company has in releasing software and then quickly fixing any bugs that have shown up. Okay, and not releasing it with any bugs that could put you out of business because it was attached to some real-time processing component of your business, as we talked about in the last couple of slides. Okay, now we're going to go to the other side, talking about the cost of quality. Okay, these are the different costs of quality. Prevention costs, and those are what we do to sort of, make sure we have, the underlying environment or high level of quality. And appraisal cost is, conducting technical reviews, data collection, metrics evaluation, testing, debugging, maybe even taking finished products off the assembly line and testing them. And then what did that say? Between those are preventive costs and appraisal costs, but then there are two general groups. Internal failure costs are the rework, repair, failure mode analysis, and external failure costs are those costs if these failures only come to light after this product is in the marketplace, and they only come to light after you have customers using this product. Okay, and clearly, internal failure costs are a lot less expensive than external failure costs because you don't have the cost of, you don't have, complaint resolution, you don't have product return and replacement, i.e. warranty work, and you also don't have the negative impact to your reputation. Right? Internal failure costs, firstly, no one outside your company gets to know how much they work. And so they're not going to impact your reputation. External failure cost, your reputation is another external failure cost. internal failure, of course, yeah, you want to have internal failures, because that's the way you test the product, right? And you find those failures, and you correct them. And so if you look at the relative cost to find and repair a defect, if you look at, requirements, design, coding, testing, maintenance, the later you find a problem, the more it's going to cost you. By a significant amount. If during requirements you realize you missed something, it may cost $140, and if you only find it after it's out in the field, it would cost you $14,000. So instead of costing you $140, it's not costing you $1,400, but costing you $14,000. So it's 2 orders of magnitude more. So from finding it here to finding it there, it's 2 orders of magnitude greater. And that's why when we look at, it's important to spend time in these early phases, because you don't have to find a lot of errors to make it worthwhile to have spent the extra time. Because any error you don't find, if you find it here, it's going to cost you 2 orders of magnitude. So it pays to spend that extra time, because you don't have to find a hell of a lot to have justified that time you spent. Make sense? Yes? No? Hello? Yes or no? You? Does it make sense? You're not sure?
Makes sense.
No, I'm asking you.
Yes.
Okay, but this, it's important to realize that these are statistics that have been around forever, and negligence liability,
sorry, it's not that, like, the increase, but it's 1994. I thought it more, but it's just, it's like 700% more. If you could go to the chart previously, the previous slide, it's like from like 1,000 to 7,000 from the COVID development testing. I didn't realize that's a lot. I mean, are these actual, like, good source? I mean, where do people get these data from?
well,
And then
this is
it's
basically,
doubles up from testing to maintenance.
there are lots of, studies that have been done over time, and it will vary somewhat by different types of systems. But then largely these are, averages, and they have, very distinct numbers at the end, but it doesn't really mean it's that distinct. It's just when you're dealing with, a large number.
But testing is still in-house, though. It's the internal, like, testing. So somehow could pick up to 7,000 from and bury 1,000. So I'm just curious. I mean, is it like across the board? I mean,
Well, what you're saying is, let's just assume this is a combination of, all of testing.
Oh, okay.
Okay? And then if you wanted to, you could put it, that you find it in the early phases of testing, that you find it in user acceptance testing, and you'd see a significant difference.
Also, this chart is from 2001, isn't there?
Yeah, but the numbers have not changed.
Oh, okay. I see.
Okay? Yes. The chart is old, but the numbers haven't changed a lot. But what I'm saying is, if you found it at user acceptance testing, you're much closer to this number. Okay? And the other hand, if you found it, let's say, in unit testing, you're right here. Okay? You see where I'm pointing?
Oh, that's still doubling from the design phase.
So that's what I'm saying is, and this would just be an average of looking at testing, but testing is, literally you're starting at unit testing, and then you're going up to user acceptance testing.
I mean, quadrupling is already off, but this is 700%.
Yeah.
It's tremendous.
It is. And that's still true today.
Oh, okay.
Okay, negligence and liability. Okay, and that just, depends again on, the damage to your company's reputation is not dependent on negligence and liability. Negligence and liability is just the decisions you have to make of what you are going to spend your money on, if you will, to avoid, because you want to avoid, negligence, you want to avoid liability, either if you're sued or by not meeting, some government standards. And so clearly when you're defining good enough, the minimum good enough you're going to want to define is to protect you from liability. Fair enough? Quality, risk, and security. Okay, low quality software increases risks. Litigation, it can be hacked and it increases security risks. A secure system cannot be built without focusing on quality, and low quality software is liable to contain architectural flaws as well as implementation problems. And that gets back as well as what you were pointing at, and your implementation problems are just bugs. But that's not a problem that you should have found back in requirements or analysis. Architectural flaws are those quality issues or mistakes or omissions that you should have found back in requirements or back in analysis or back in design. And those architectural flaws are the ones that you can compare that 2 orders of magnitude. Implementation problems, that really comes into what we said earlier when, what level of implementation bugs is the marketplace willing to accept from a company with your experience. And that would be the definition of good enough on implementation problems and bugs, where a company like Microsoft, over time, people have just become willing to accept that if you're going to buy the first release or the second release, you're going to have more bugs in the software. Okay, and that's viewed as if you're developing it within Microsoft, you can have one aim for what does good enough mean for, implementation issues. On the other hand, if you're working for your own company and you just started, you will have a much lower tolerance. Okay, impact of management decisions. We don't usually think of that, but they impact quality a lot. Estimation decisions, scheduling decisions, and risk-oriented decisions. We usually don't think about the fact that management decisions will, at the end of the day, impact quality. And again, this is one of the things that, I can't tell you that the management decisions are a quantitative aspect, but they impact the level of quality quantitatively, and that if you're pushed to too short a delivery date, if the project plan is not really thought out in terms of the interdependencies of one task to another task, and are you reacting to each crisis as was a one-off? Or have you developed, self-checking mechanisms as you're developing this product to go check for issues and problems and errors as you're going along the development process? So one way of managing it is that every time that you find an error, treat it as a one-off. Okay, we've got to fix this. And forget the fact that we've had, things that look like, first cousins of this. We've already had 10 of those. Forget it. Each one that we have, we just address it as a new issue, as opposed to having a mechanism to actually, monitor these kinds of risks as you go along. So what we're trying to do now is looking at management by saying these types of management decisions are going to impact a lot of aspects of your customers' satisfaction with your product. These management decisions are going to impact a lot of aspects of quality. These management decisions are going to impact pretty much not just the estimation, the scheduling, and risk-oriented decisions, but they're going to impact the overall cost of your development, and they're going to impact the overall quality of your development. And so the reason we look at that is if we're trying to look at what are the root causes, and we talked about that earlier. So what are the root causes of quality problems? Well, one of the root causes of quality problems is poor management. Not necessarily the strongest root cause, but definitely one of the root causes of quality problems would be poor management. And to build high quality software, you have to understand the problems to be solved to create a quality design, and you have to have good project management with explicit techniques for quality and change management. And if you look at those 1, 2, and 3, they relate exactly to what we said about, 15 minutes into this class, about, the underlying quality of, the work being done, and the underlying quality of, the amount of testing being done, the underlying quality of project management, the underlying quality of what we were talking about. And so that's really what we're talking about here, right? We talked about change management. And so that's what we're talking about as 3 of the areas within project management that you have to, continually monitor as part of project management before you raise your red flag and say, no, this is no longer doable. Okay, anyone here taking a course in project management? Undergraduate? Okay. Graduate, not yet. Okay. But if you look at project management, what you'll see is project management will have explicit techniques for quality and change management, and by definition, those have a direct impact on software quality. So when you're looking at project management, you'll be looking at techniques for quality and change management, but what that then leads you to is impacts on your quality. Okay, quality control, quality assurance, quality control or inspection reviews and tests, quality assurance is auditing and reporting procedures to actually identify areas that have a higher than expected number of problems, and so therefore you can make decisions to change that part of the process. That's what quality assurance is. And then defect prediction is identifying software that are more likely to have quality issues. And then machine learning and statistical models are ways of, doing a better job on being able to identify relationships between all of these metrics and how that translates to defective parts of your software product. Okay, because we really, for some of these quantitative analyses, there's a one-to-one between, this problem and this quality issue that surfaced in the final product. But most of the metrics that you're measuring don't have a clear one-to-one between this particular metric and this particular quality issue in the final product. And so, machine learning and statistical models might be a way to give you a way of relating those individual issues to the end result. And if you can do that, that also helps you determine where to spend more time or money on addressing those issues. Okay?
I also want to add something to the previous slide with the machine learning. It was like a predictive
This one?
analytics. The machine learning, the next slide.
This one?
Yeah, machine learning, the last one. Oh, I guess, let's say like predictive analytics. That was a good keyword. It seems to be trending though, the news, so I'm picking up.
Yes. But so what I'm just saying is, so when we've gone through this whole chapter of, what do they call it, quality concepts, we keep going back and forth between, what can we measure explicitly, and then what are some of, the qualitative impacts. Realize that the fact that certain level of errors are acceptable for different types of companies isn't really a qualitative issue. That's still a quantitative issue. That just says that depending on a company's reputation and size, it can sustain products that have a higher level of faults in initial release. So that's not a qualitative issue. I think if you look at, some of these chapters in the book, I think were, they were all good, but some of them, and I went through it even if they had, different lists, it was sort of really hard to differentiate, what was the difference between, design guidelines and design something else, and then what is the difference between both of them. So I can understand where there was some confusion. I think that this chapter, at least, in the way I looked at it, had a much clearer definition of quality, what the quantitative dimensions of quality are we can look at, and going through the achieving software quality, what we might want to look at in terms of addressing what I call the root causes, what the text is called achieving software quality. Yes?
I was going to say, I think the book was very detailed, but it kind of like splits it up in one very key point, so it goes to another part, and then it'll explain a little bit more. I think the slides make it easier to understand,
Okay,
very much. That, to me anyways.
okay.
Because when I looked at it and I answered the questions, yeah, I could get it, but I'm not gonna lie, I also had to look in other places to piece it together.
Okay, fair point, and I said I was sorry that no one told me you didn't have the slides posted on Blackboard.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? If someone had told me, I mean, you had the book, but if that the slides weren't posted, I would have posted them, so I'm sorry about that. But, and maybe that's one reason I didn't go over the questions and the answers. Usually I do it before we discuss the chapter, but this time we'll do it, after we discuss the chapter, just for those, two questions I have given you. Okay, so you look at quality concepts. Do you think that after having read the chapter, I assume that at least after you did that and done the homework, do you think that now having, listened to this presentation, if you will, with using the slides in this presentation, that it now does a better job of holding together what we mean by quality concepts and what we mean by still having to be quantitative for the concept? Yes, sir. Seriously.
Yeah, no, kind of puts it in perspective, because like a lot of like software development teams and programs, they'll hide a lot of their bugs and just good enough when they finish a product, and they'll hide it from their consumers or from their end users. And what happens is people kind of debug or find these little bits and pieces.
Yeah, but you can't hide it forever.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And then what they do, they're like, oh, we don't have to fix it. No one will notice until someone does. And then they fix it, or they'll, well, it's been out for 3-4 years.
And that's the other thing is, when companies can develop a reputation that if you come back to them with a problem, they will investigate it and they will fix it. Okay, and that's better than, you'd rather have a company that has, a grade of 85 on good enough. But if you come to them with an issue, they'll investigate it and they'll fix it. As opposed to a company that might have a grade of 90 on good enough, or 95, but when you come to them with a problem, they say, well, we have a grade of 95, and so you probably did something wrong. And you have to spend a heck of an amount of time, proving to them that no, they have a problem, and then getting them to fix it. And so, that those 2 points, are, important to remember. Also, especially if you have a smaller company, you want to develop a reputation that, yes, we're not perfect, but we, when you bring something to our attention, if we do have an error, we will fix it. And that's very important. I remember a long time ago, I was a kid, and, I was nervous about buying a used car, as opposed to a new car. And, so I went to some used car dealer that some of my friends had bought from, and then I ended up buying a few cars from the person. Said to me, listen, yeah, we do test the cars, we go over them. I can't guarantee you the car that you're going to buy are in perfect shape. But I will, and if you bring it back to me, we'll fix it. And it was like, I can't guarantee you this. Everything is perfect. But if you come back with a problem, we'll get it fixed. And yes, obviously, if you have, 100 problems a week, that doesn't do you any good. But at least it said was, if you find a problem, we won't give you a hard time, we'll fix it. And they actually did do that. And that, was worth more than, maybe having less problems, but if you had a problem, then there was nobody home. And the same thing really applies when we talk about this whole area of quality concept. And then the next chapter of quality assurance which is, what do we have to do on an ongoing basis to maintain this level of quality that we think we need. And understand that that's always going to be, it's the same thing, you have to decide what level you as a company need have in order to succeed. And part of that is, what kind of reputation do you want to have? It could be based on lots of things, but you have to end up with some understanding within your organization what level of quality are we actually shooting for. The same thing with how much you're going to sell the product for, right? If you're a low-cost price leader, the odds are that your target market will accept somewhat lower level of quality as long as things get fixed. If you're, not a price leader, but a leader of, capabilities, and that's why you can charge more, there's going to be a lot less tolerance for errors. And so, you've got to understand whatever business you're in, you've got to make an explicit decision, what level of quality do I need to succeed, and then what do I have to do to get there. And don't say I have to aim to be perfect. No one can be perfect. And you don't want to spend the money to be 99.999% perfect either. Okay? But what you have to do is you've got to look at your company, look at your target market, and look at your competition, right? And then based on that, make a decision. What, if I want to make part of my advertising that, you're not going to find at the highest level quality, and that's going to be my primary advertising, my marketing thrust, then you probably have to have less of a tolerance for problems. If part of your marketing thrust is going to be an excellent level of customer service and an excellent level of fixing any issues that come up within a defined short time frame, okay, if that's your marketing thrust, you could probably aim for a somewhat lower level that you go fix the things that come up. So you've got to make an explicit decision what level of quality are you aiming. There's no such thing as the right level of quality for everyone, the right level of quality for every company, the right level of quality for every product line within the company. And that's the thing I want to leave you with is just saying that we're aiming for perfect quality is BS. And worse than BS, saying that we're aiming for perfect quality, what that really says is that's a mistake. Because you're going to spend so much goddamn money waste to aim for perfect quality. So it's going to cost you more to build this product, so you're going to have to charge more. You're going to have to spend extra time, so you'll be late in the market. And guess what? If that's not what your target market is looking for, you just wasted a lot of money. And you wasted a lot of development time, and you're going to sell less because you're selling it for more money. And so, when anyone says, we're looking to be, quality, it's easy. We're always aiming to be 100% perfect. And in the real world, that's not the right answer. The right answer is to determine we have to match the quality our target market is looking for with the quality we aim to provide. You don't want to aim to provide a much higher level of quality than your target market is looking for, and you can't provide a lower level than your target market is looking for. Either way will hurt your company. And what you've got to do is match the level of quality that you're providing with the level of quality that your target market is looking for. And that's really my final, thoughts for today, and it applies to systems development, and it applies to any other business you might be. You've got to figure out what level of quality does your target market expect. And then that's your goal. You don't want to spend money that you didn't have to spend, that's sort of wasted money. And so and I'd say that most people don't realize. And that's important, not just in looking at, quality within software development, but that's important in terms of any business that you might be. How to determine the quality you want. You got to start by understanding what level of target market needs and wants. Okay, listen, enjoy spring break. Now it's like you had 2 spring breaks. We didn't meet last Monday, right? And now we're not going to meet next Monday. But so I guess it's now, for this class, it's your second spring break. So you had your first spring break last week, and your second spring break next week, right? Anyway, take care.
我现在不是 coding 的那个 assessment 吗？发过来我做了一下，那个电脑不错，过了，然后我突然间这个发了几是一个project base 实际上。
Okay? And then we go over your exam. No problem. Go on.
招聘的那个16到18，不写了直接发，去你大爷的！这16到18，我40发，我操！我吐了，我看到16到18块你妈！谁他妈谁家都这么低？
他妈就问我那一个东西我一点都不会，他妈的他那个高并发编程编辑这个他妈的他妈 CS 怎么学这些东西啊？他应该是
这个有一点深。
怎么说呢？这个 CS 专业嘛，学专业它分支的嘛。这个地方我有个朋友在 mp3cutnet 那里的，他说以前那个刚刚是专门就玩找那个 SBE 工作的那个，他应该是学这个。妈的，他为什么这个一点都不会？他说那个 SIM 什么同步那个我一点都不会。然后呢，他再问我他那个什么 refresh， 他妈什么是 refresh？ 他那个 refresh， 他应该就是那个矿界里面的东西啊。他跟我说，这有一个它里面有这个 refresh， 你怎么拖它出来？他妈的，这多少？这个没有过。妈的，我一点都不会，我不说。哎，他妈要叫再找不看那个实习，都不知道怎么办。现在没有实习开。他妈的，我看那个配今天一点都没开啊！什么都没有，我是吧？再见，拜拜。 他真的是高配车了。